This month is Nonfiction November, so I wanted to make a reading guide to my favorite war memoirs of all time. I'm not going to put them in order of like worst to best. They're my favorites. They don't need an order, but I'm going to talk about them in chronological order of when the wars happened. I'm going to start with Storm of Steel by Ernst Junger. Now, this is the book about World War I. You are not going to get anything more raw and real about what it is like to be on the front lines. Ernst Junger has this amazing prose. The way he writes reads like a epic more than it does a modern memoir. It started as his diaries, just kind of condensed down, talking about this happened, and his reflections and stuff like that. Over time, he refined Storm of Steel. I mean, he was tinkering with it his entire life. And what you get is a gripping memoir of his experiences as a German soldier in World War I. There's no politics or ideology. It is just the intense, raw experience of combat and survival. This gives you the raw human side of combat for the Germans. He has this very interesting, like detached, stoic acceptance of the horrors of war in a way that a lot of other writers would not be willing to admit to. There's just so much going on in this book. The translation that I have, it's the Penguin Classics edition translated by Michael Hoffman. I think most of them are this edition. I really like it. The introduction is great. He talks about Ernst Junger, talks about his life, the earlier translation and how it sucks. And this is just really good. I kind of equate it to the nonfiction version of All Quiet on the Western Front, but better. Like one of my issues with a lot of World War I literature and nonfiction is it's like almost too reflective, and it's like, oh, this was the last war of imperialism, and they're like overly romantic about the war, and when what I really want is a brutal account of the combat from a soldier's point of view. It's also just a great read because Ernst Junger was such a talented writer. He was not at the beginning. It talks about how he barely got out of school. Like he didn't even write like the final essays to get out of like whatever high school. You know, this guy went on to be a very prominent writer in the literary community. Definitely check that one out. Now let's move on to 3 books, and they all involve Marines in the Pacific theater of World War II. And I think it's really important that I lump them together and emphasize why you should read all 3 and how different they are from one another. With the Old Breed by E.B. Sledge is a harrowing memoir of the author's experiences as a U.S. Marine in the Pacific theater during World War II. Specifically in the battles of Peleliu and Okinawa, Sledge provides a visceral account of combat, vividly describing the horrors, hardships, and camaraderie that defined life on the front lines. One thing you're going to see in all of these is the camaraderie aspect. I mean, the bonds that happen in war don't happen anywhere else. This book is one of the most detailed and unfiltered accounts of combat in the Pacific. The thing I like most about this one is Sledge is completely honest about the brutality of combat. Also has a heavy emphasis on the resilience of people fighting in these situations. As a quick aside, the Pacific was basically a different war than the rest of World War II. The level of brutality was just completely different than you see on the Western Front. Like, I'm not a historian or anything, but when it comes to the U.S. fighting, the Axis, the Pacific theater was the most brutal. Like, we're not going to get into the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front could be its own war. Fun fact, they used more munitions and had more casualties on the Eastern Front than all of World War I, and that's just the Eastern Front. That should also be its own war. I mean, that thing was an atrocity all by itself, which is why I want to read Bloodlands. But anyways, let me get out of this aside. I'm going to ramble forever. The other book that pairs really well with Sledge's With the Old Breed is Helmet for My Pillow by Robert Leckie. It's a memoir about his experiences as a Marine in the Pacific theater. His focus starts with boot camp and works all the way to the end of the war. He fought in Guadalcanal, Cape Gloucester, and Peleliu. And Leckie, unlike Sledge, has a very lyrical style of writing and a slightly different viewpoint when it comes to highlighting the trauma of combat and the bonds forged in war. He's a lot more reflective in his writing than Sledge. Sledge has like this very clinical view, and I think it comes from the fact that Leckie ended up as a historian and a writer and very focused on like the humanities and the literary side of writing about combat, while Sledge was a scientist. They work great together because a lot of the stuff is the same, but you see these two very different perspectives on the same war. And to finish off the trifecta, we have Goodbye Darkness by William Manchester. This is probably my favorite war memoir of all time. And the reason it works so great with these other two is because Manchester is looking at the events 40 years later. He's an old man, and also he is like one of the best nonfiction writers of his generation. I know that's a pretty bold claim, but I think he is, and this is my video. And that's one of the things that makes his story so different. Like the other two, they weren't professional writers, but they were writing their experiences. Well, William Manchester takes his experiences and he gives you this broader perspective. He kind of shows you the pieces of the war as they come together and talks about the land where it happened and then his own horrifying experiences. And he goes deeper than these other people into just how raw and brutal things can be. The beginning of the book is him talking about the first time he kills someone, and it's traumatic how raw it is. And it's not like that in the other books. And so I think with all three of them combined, you get a very comprehensive view of what it was like to be a Marine on the front lines in the Pacific Theater. They're all great books. You could just read any one of them and be happy. Now, this next one also has to do with World War II because, I mean, let's face it, tens of millions of people experienced that war. And this one is Beyond Band of Brothers, The War Memoirs of Major Dick Winters. So this is Dick Winters writing about his experiences that are covered in Band of Brothers by Stephen Ambrose. Band of Brothers is good, and this is a lot of the same stuff just from Major Dick Winters' perspective. And one of the things I really like about this is he talks about the why some of the things happened, and he talks about like what he did when it came to leadership. Like Sledge and Leckie were like privates. They didn't move up to leadership roles. Well, Dick Winters started out in the war as a commissioned officer. And so you have this different perspective. And also you have a paratrooper versus Marines on boats and completely different theater. And I think, you know, all four of them make like a really, really good way of seeing what World War II was like. But what I was saying was in Beyond Band of Brothers, Winters does a really good job of talking about leadership. He talks about PTSD before it had a name. And he said that each soldier kind of has a cup, and these traumatic experiences fill the cup up. Some have bigger cups, some have smaller cups. And the other thing is when you take a soldier off the front lines, some soldiers, their cup empties a little faster than the others. But if it fills all the way up and spills over, they're done. And he was talking about kind of how he would recognize an issue that a soldier was having, and he would pull them back and just give them that time to breathe away from the front lines and just trying to keep up morale and look after his soldiers. And I really like this officer perspective. And it's also just written really well. I mean, the book also has lots of pictures. It's really cool. I'm a really big fan of this book. And like I said, it does pair well with Band of Brothers, but honestly, I would read this over Band of Brothers. Like Band of Brothers is good. Stephen Ambrose does a really good job of writing a very compelling narrative. I really like memoirs when it comes to combat. Now that we're done with World War II, we move on to immediately after World War II, and that is About Face by Colonel David Hackworth. So this is his time in the army to when he lied and enlisted at like 15 or 14 or something like that. He served with the combat veterans of World War II in the occupation of Italy. And then after that, he moves on to talking about his experiences in Korea. David Hackworth was one of the most decorated soldiers in U.S. Army history. He was the combat soldier. He basically had every position you could have as a frontline soldier. He started as a private, occupying a country at the end of a war. Then he fought in Korea twice. And you get all of his life experiences in the army, and you see how the army changed from the end of World War II all the way to when he got fired, basically, toward the end of the Vietnam War. And the reason he got fired was because he did an interview and was like, we can't win this war the way this is being fought. Like, these officers higher up have no idea what's going on. They're just coming here to get like a stamp on their resume and then go back. And, you know, usually when someone would say that, you're like, well, what does he know? Well, he showed up in Vietnam for his second or third time and completely turned around the soldiers that he was sent there to lead. They were just like the losers. They had like the worst combat record, and he whipped them into shape. And the reason he did it was because he wanted them to survive. So much of this book is him discussing leadership, the decisions he made, and why they mattered. And he does such a wonderful job of showing you the brutality of combat that the United States fought over 20 years. This man was fighting in in 1950 and in 1970. Just reading his section on the Korean War is eye-opening because he was there when it started, when it was just the absolute bloodbath from way up in the north all the way to the south and then all the way up to the middle. Like, he was there. Then you have him going back like 3 years later when the war has just been like locked down. No one wants to fight. They don't want to go forward. No one wants to fight them. It's just like trench combat. And he's like, what are we doing here? Like, are we trying to win or what? And yet again, he's talking about discipline and like wanting to win and leading in a way that you will succeed. It's just really interesting. I don't think there's another book that shows you how U.S. military doctrine changed over that era, especially from the eyes of someone directly involved with leading soldiers in combat. It's just really, really good. Like, I'm gushing about it because it really is fantastic. This last one is very interesting, and I can guarantee you pretty much no one else on BookTube has ever talked about it. That is Fireforce by Chris Cox, One Man's War in the Rhodesian Light Infantry. This reads a lot like Vietnam memoirs because we're talking about a guy, well, I'll just read off the back. Fireforce is the compelling, brutal but true accounts of Chris Cox's service in 3 Commando Rhodesian Light Infantry during the Bush War. Serving in 3 Commando's elite ranks, other than born Rhodesians, were British, South Africans, Americans, Australians, New Zealanders, and a host of other nationalities. It was the closest parallel to the French Foreign Legion in recent times. He joined after he was drafted at the age of 18, and then he just signed on for 3 more years. But like, he talks about how he had like a very sheltered life growing up and then was thrown into this combat and being a soldier in the Bush War and just the radical change that it had on him as a person. And it talks a lot about the strain of combat, especially in this war where they have no external resources for munitions and weapons and stuff like that, and they did a lot with what little they had. This book is not for like the squeamish or faint of heart. He is very graphic with what goes on in combat and in the Bush War especially. I mean, it was awful. Like, you have both sides committing atrocities, but could you imagine being on patrol, getting out of a helicopter, rolling up to a village, and everyone's been butchered with machetes, and you're just like, oh, I now have to watch my friend's back while he buries these children. It's just written in a way that you don't see in a lot of other war memoirs, and it really messed him up. I was just looking at the description on the back, and it's like, this will be to the Rhodesian War what All Quiet on the Western Front was to World War I. And I think they're right. I initially wanted to equate it to Storm of Steel, but this is a lot more emotional and has a lot more emphasis on the personal costs of fighting in a war like this. And yeah, I added this one to the end because this book is unique. You're not going to read another memoir like this. You're not going to have anyone else telling you that you should check it out. A friend of mine gave me this. This is a signed first edition from South Africa. Like, he moved to South Africa after the end of the Bush War and almost drank himself to death. He had horrific PTSD. Like it says on the back, read it. It will be an experience you will never forget. It lives rent free in my head. I don't know if that's a good thing. That's my list. I really hope you look into some of these. They're very good. Nonfiction November is just a good excuse to kind of dive into things like this. I'll end up making another one of these someday. I think I'm going to read The Forgotten Soldier by Guy Sayer at some point. I think it was on my 40 before 40, or I cut it from my 40 before 40, so it's like my 41 before 41 or something, along with some other war memoirs. I really like them. I like that we're getting an honest look from the people who were there. And speaking of an honest look from the people who were there, your boy Robert Leckie was a historian and a journalist, and he covered the Korean War. I have his book up there. It's called Conflict, the History of the Korean War. I'm looking forward to reading that too. I have like 6 or 7 Korean War books up there that I want to get to. Let me know in the comments if you have a Korean War book that you think stands above the rest, because I don't know where to start. I got too many of them. Let me also know in the comments if you have any war memoirs you'd recommend, or if you've read any of these, like With the Old Breed and Helmet for My Pillow were an inspiration for The Pacific, the sequel to Band of Brothers. So some of you have probably heard of it or have watched that. I believe that Leckie is one of the characters in the show. I don't know. I haven't seen it. Maybe I should watch that. This is another one of those, I'm so pretentious, I just read the books and then tell you that when you bring up the TV show. I'm not doing it on purpose. I just prefer the books. But anyways, I don't know where this is going anymore. I want to thank you for watching. And with that, I'll see you next time.